They told me it was a temporary reassignment. I knew it was punishment. One week, I was managing financial due diligence for a $600 million acquisition. The next, I was an intern again, sharing a desk with college students who thought I was their supervisor. No warning. No explanation. Just a short meeting with Evelyn Ward, our CFO, the woman who once called me her right hand. She didn't even look up from her laptop when she said it. "Consider this a development opportunity," she murmured, tapping away. "It'll help you reconnect with the fundamentals." I remember her tone, gentle, dismissive, almost bored. It was the kind of cruelty that doesn't scream, it smiles. I sat there frozen, watching the woman I'd worked beside for 6 years reduce me to a footnote in front of HR. When I left her office, I could still hear laughter behind me. Someone whispered, "Guess she's not so essential after all." That line stayed with me longer than it should have. They took my office, my projects, even my corporate card. They gave me a cubicle beside the copier and an intern badge that barely fit around my neck. Everyone smiled at me like I was invisible, too polite to mock me out loud, too eager not to. But the funny thing about humiliation is how it sharpens your focus. I stopped trying to prove myself. I stopped caring about their whispers. Instead, I started listening, watching, collecting. You learn things when no one sees you as a threat. You hear conversations that were never meant for you. You notice the shortcuts, the signatures, the oversights. You see how easily power blinds the people who hold it. Evelyn was brilliant. I'll give her that. But she was also reckless. She'd built her empire on speed, on skipping details for headlines. And that acquisition, the one that made her a star, was full of details. Dangerous ones. I knew because I'd written most of them. A year before my demotion, I drafted a risk clause, small, technical, buried deep in the contract structure. It was meant to protect the company in case of non-compliance during mergers. Evelyn signed off on it without reading. I remember warning her, half-jokingly, that skipping audits could backfire someday. She laughed and said, "Then I'll just blame you." Funny how the universe listens. So when I became the intern, I didn't fight back. I fetched coffee, I smiled, I stayed late when no one asked. But every night I opened archived files, spreadsheets, internal memos, tracing every irregularity I could find. I wasn't looking for revenge then. I was looking for proof. Proof that Evelyn's success wasn't built on genius, but on deceit. And the deeper I dug, the more I saw the pattern. Offshore invoices, consulting fees, and phantom vendors that conveniently vanished right before audits. It wasn't sloppiness. It was strategy. She thought she was untouchable. She thought no one was watching. But I was. The day she demoted me, she didn't silence me. She made me invisible, and invisibility, in a place built on secrets, is power. So I waited, quietly, patiently, like a storm forming behind clear skies. Because one day soon, the same clause she ignored would come back. And when it did, it wouldn't just end her career. It would expose everything she built, and the best part, she'd never see it coming. Before everything collapsed, Evelyn and I were a perfect team. At least that's how it looked on paper. She was the face of our department. I was the backbone. She gave the speeches, and I built the numbers that made them believable. When I first joined the company, I admired her. She was everything I thought success looked like: articulate, composed, commanding. The kind of woman who could turn silence into authority. She mentored me, or so I thought. Late nights in the glass conference room, we'd review projections until sunrise. She'd say, "You have a gift for details. That's rare. Never lose it." But when the board started noticing those details, my details, her tone changed. Suddenly, I was too independent. My ideas became too risky. She stopped introducing me in meetings. She'd present my models as her own, smoothing over the parts that scared her and taking full credit for the rest. I didn't complain. I told myself this was how the game worked. I was young, ambitious, still naive enough to believe talent spoke louder than politics. Then came the acquisition. The biggest deal in the firm's history. A $600 million merger with a European fintech company. I was tasked with building the core valuation models, while Evelyn managed the negotiations. We worked side by side for 8 months. Every figure, every clause, every projection ran through my desk. That's when I created it. The indemnity clause. A small, hidden line in the acquisition contract that shifted liability if certain audits were skipped or falsified. It wasn't sabotage. It was standard risk protection. Evelyn skimmed it, waved it off, and said, "We'll never need that." But she did. The deal closed. The company celebrated. The press called her the woman who reshaped corporate finance. I was proud until I saw the headlines. My name was nowhere, not even in the footnotes. Weeks later, during a post-acquisition audit, I noticed discrepancies in vendor expenses, payments routed to consulting firms that didn't exist 6 months earlier. I flagged it privately to Evelyn. She brushed it off, saying, "We can fix that later. Don't make noise about this now." That's when I realized the truth. She wasn't careless. She was covering something. And not long after that conversation, my reassignment letter arrived. Temporary restructuring due to organizational needs. Effective immediately. They cleared out my office before I even returned from lunch. HR escorted me to a new cubicle. Evelyn didn't even attend the meeting. She just sent a message, "Focus on learning. Growth looks different for everyone." The bitterness didn't hit me right away. At first it was confusion, then disbelief, then silence. I went home that night and stared at the contract draft on my laptop. The clause stared back at me like a ghost from another life. That's when I started backing up everything. Emails, reports, invoices, every document I'd ever touched. If Evelyn wanted me forgotten, fine. But she'd also forgotten what I'd built, and who wrote the fine print she was now standing on. In corporate war, revenge isn't about shouting louder. It's about remembering longer, and I never forgot. The first few weeks of my internship felt like exile. I became invisible. A ghost in the system I once helped run. My job now was data entry, coffee runs, and silent attendance in meetings I used to lead. But invisibility has its advantages. No one hides their secrets from someone they don't see. I sat near the financial operations server, quietly watching as senior analysts logged transactions they barely understood. They were sloppy, attaching the wrong codes, skipping verification, and approving invoices from vendors that didn't exist in the master list. I knew those vendor names. I'd seen them before. Tucked into Evelyn's acquisition spreadsheets, labeled as external consultants. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. But late one evening, as the office emptied, I stayed back and opened archived files on the shared drive. That's when I found it. A folder marked Advisory Transfers, Confidential. Inside were payment logs totaling several $1,000,000, all funneled to a boutique firm registered under a name that made my stomach twist. Ward Strategic Advisors. Ward. Evelyn's last name. I cross-checked the ownership records through a public database. The listed managing partner? Daniel Ward. Her brother. It all made sense. The inflated consulting fees, the rush to finalize audits, the reason she buried my clause, it all pointed to one thing. She had used the acquisition to enrich her family through shell companies. And by skipping the post-acquisition compliance checks, she had violated the very clause that would make her personally liable. I sat there staring at the screen, my heart pounding. If I exposed this, it wouldn't just end her career. It could bring down the entire acquisition. But if I said nothing, she'd keep winning. And people like her always win, don't they? That night, I copied every file onto an encrypted drive and hid it under a new name. It wasn't about revenge anymore, but it was about truth. About justice in a place that had forgotten what that word even meant. The next morning, Evelyn walked past my desk, radiant as ever, holding a glass of green juice and her usual air of untouchable grace. She glanced at me with that polished smile and said softly, "Good morning." Intern. She didn't know that the intern had already found the thread that could unravel her empire, and I was just beginning to pull. Evelyn's downfall began, ironically, with her own paranoia. The more she tried to control everything, the sloppier she became. Her temper flared in meetings. Her polished composure cracked in quiet hallways. She was desperate to close the second phase of the acquisition, the integration deal that would cement her reputation. But she didn't know that the walls were already closing in. I was there, every step, pretending to take notes, fetching reports she'd never read, acting like the obedient intern she wanted me to be. What she didn't realize was that every document she signed, every rushed approval, every fake vendor she pushed through, I was tracing it, building the puzzle piece by piece. Then, one afternoon, she called me into her office. Her tone was calm, but her eyes were sharp. "I've been hearing things," she said, "that you've been overstepping." My stomach tightened. "Overstepping?" She leaned back, crossing her arms. "Asking too many questions. Accessing files you don't need. I hope you're not confused about your role here." I knew she suspected me. She just didn't have proof yet. So I smiled and said, "Of course not. I'm just trying to learn." She studied me for a long second, then nodded. "Good, because curiosity can be dangerous." The message was clear, but she didn't scare me anymore, not after what I had found. That night, I reviewed my encrypted files again. The payment logs, the cross-company invoices, and most importantly, the clause from the acquisition contract. It stated word for word, "In the event of omitted or falsified audit data, liability for financial irregularities shall revert to the signatory authority overseeing due diligence." That signatory was Evelyn Ward. The irony was almost poetic. She had signed her own downfall, and I had written the line, "That would make it possible." The final piece fell into place when I received an email from the legal compliance department, a routine audit request asking for archived vendor documentation. Evelyn's team had ignored it for months. If those missing audits resurfaced, the clause would automatically trigger liability reassignment. So I made a decision that night, a quiet, irreversible one. I would make sure the legal team got what they were looking for. But I didn't send it directly. I contacted someone I trusted, a junior attorney named Lauren who used to sit in on my old acquisition briefings. She respected me once before the demotion. I sent her a message from an anonymous address. "Review the vendor relationship between Ward Strategic Advisors and the acquisition fund accounts. Cross-check signatures." I attached just one document, a small, seemingly harmless payment authorization. Evelyn's signature at the bottom gleamed like a confession. 2 days later, chaos began to ripple through the office. Compliance was suddenly reviewing historical documentation. Senior analysts whispered in corners. Evelyn snapped at assistants for misplacing files she never gave them. And then, in an emergency finance meeting, the CEO demanded an explanation for inconsistencies flagged in the post-acquisition audit. Evelyn's face went pale. She blamed accounting errors. She blamed interns. She even hinted that I might have misfiled something. But this time no one looked convinced. The CFO, the woman who once orchestrated every move with precision, was unraveling in real time. After the meeting, she cornered me in the corridor. Her voice was low, sharp as glass. "What did you do?" I met her eyes and said, "Nothing you didn't sign yourself." Her expression froze. For the first time, she looked unsure, vulnerable, human. Then she whispered, "You don't know what you've started." But I did, because in that moment, I realized she wasn't just scared of exposure. She was terrified of the truth being documented. And I had more than enough documentation to make sure this time she couldn't rewrite the ending. I didn't want theatrics. I wanted certainty. Revenge in the boardroom isn't a scene from a movie. It's a sequence of quiet, unassailable moves that leave no room for spin. So I drafted a plan that looked like compliance work, not retaliation. That way, when the pieces fell, they'd fall exactly where I intended. First, containment. I couldn't allow Evelyn to see the trail I'd found. If she smelled a leak, she would bury files, intimidate witnesses, or rewrite vendor histories. So I compartmentalized everything. Copies on an encrypted drive, mirrored in cloud locations she couldn't access, physical printouts hidden in a safe deposit I rented under a consultant's name. I spread the evidence across channels that required independent verification: accounting logs, vendor contracts, email chains, and scanned signatures. Each file had a timestamp and a traceable origin. Paper has a way of outliving excuses. Second, leverage. The indemnity clause I'd written wasn't a threat on its own. It was a mechanism. I had to chain it to concrete misrepresentations so the auditors couldn't dodge it. That meant creating a narrative the legal teams would accept. An audit trail showing that critical vendor confirmations were omitted, and that payments were routed to entities tied to Evelyn. I created a timeline that linked signatures, approvals, and suspicious transfers. Each link was a line in a ledger, cold, numerical, impossible to charm away. Third, allies. I didn't want to rely on rage or luck. I wanted professional validation, so I reached out to people who still respected facts. Lauren, the junior attorney, was the first. I gave her the smallest, cleanest slice of evidence: a payment authorization with Evelyn's signature, and a vendor registration showing Daniel Ward as managing partner. I didn't tell her who I was. I let the document speak. She escalated it to external counsel without editorializing. Once the lawyers smelled irregularity, they followed process: subpoenas, verification requests, third-party confirmations. That was the sound of a machine being set in motion. Fourth, timing. The acquisition's integration milestone was scheduled for the end of the quarter, a date Evelyn had already celebrated publicly. If I moved too early, the board would interpret my actions as bitterness. If I moved too late, she could restructure the transactions to hide traces. So I targeted the window when external auditors would naturally request vendor confirmations. It was the perfect cover. My actions would read as routine due diligence, not vendetta. Fifth, detachment. I could have confronted her, threatened to go public, or demanded satisfaction in the open. But confrontation gives the accused a script. I refused that theater. All communication was surgical and anonymous when necessary. Redacted memos, encrypted emails, flagged compliance tickets. I kept my public persona spotless, the obedient intern taking notes, the one they underestimated. Behind the screen, I enabled processes that would force the truth into the light. Finally, contingency. People like Evelyn don't go quietly. I prepared for denials, for forged receipts, for frantic attempts to buy off witnesses. For every likely countermeasure, I had a countermeasure of my own: independent vendor audits, time-stamped server logs, a witness list of analysts who could corroborate irregular approvals. I also prepared a narrative for the board that framed the exposure as a compliance success, not as an attack on a single person. That way, the company would be incentivized to act swiftly to protect itself rather than spin. When the plan was complete, it read like a standard compliance escalation. That was intentional. I wanted the documents to be so ordinary, so process-driven, that no one could accuse me of malice. I banked on bureaucracy to be the most powerful thing in the room, because bureaucracy punishes shortcuts and protects truth when evidence is undeniable. The night before I executed the final step, I sat at my small desk, the office dim around me. My intern badge lay face up, like a card in a magician's trick. I thought about Evelyn, about how she once praised my work, how she once told me to never lose my gift for details. I smiled softly, remembering the line I tucked into the clause months ago. Accountability survives arrogance. Then I pressed send. An anonymous package of documents went to the external auditors for the acquiring firm, and a separate, redacted copy went to the company's internal compliance team with an urgent request for verification. The packets were identical, the timestamps matching, the paper trail complete. I didn't roar. I clicked. And then I waited, not with fear, but with the calm of someone who finally set a fault line in motion and knew exactly where the earthquake would break. The day of the acquisition arrived cloaked in calm, the kind that only comes before a storm. Our company boardroom had never looked so polished. Polished oak table, golden pens neatly arranged, bottled water labels turned outward, perfection masking corruption. Everyone dressed their best, their smiles rehearsed. Mr. Sloan, the man who had demoted me to an intern, sat at the head of the table like a king awaiting tribute. He didn't even glance my way. I was just the assistant, bringing in coffee for the executives, the intern who had lucked out by being allowed to witness the acquisition between our firm and Haven Capital. But what he didn't know was that I was the reason Haven Capital was even here. I had orchestrated every piece of this moment, quietly, Surgically, invisibly. When the Haven representatives arrived, the air shifted. Among them was a man named Edward Graves, known in our circle for one thing: exposing unethical mergers. He smiled when our eyes met. He knew why I'd reached out. The presentation began. Sloan spoke with the swagger of a man who thought he'd already won. He boasted about quarterly growth, client retention, team loyalty. I nearly laughed at that last part. When the Haven team requested access to internal audit reports, Sloan's confident grin wavered. Just slightly. I caught it. And then, the first grenade dropped. Edward turned to him and said, "We reviewed your financial compliance logs, and something interesting came up." Sloan tried to stay calm. "Oh? What's that?" Edward placed a file on the table. My file. The one containing every hidden transfer, every misrepresented line item, every internal manipulation Sloan had authorized to inflate the company's valuation before the sale. His face drained of color as page after page landed in front of the board. The room froze. The COO shifted uncomfortably. Legal counsel started typing furiously. Then Edward continued. "And this report, the one that uncovered all of it, came from within your own finance department. From an anonymous compliance audit conducted 6 months ago." Sloan's gaze flicked toward me. For the first time in a year, he saw me. Truly saw me. And in his eyes, I saw confusion curdle into recognition. He stood abruptly. "This is absurd. Baseless." But Edward cut him off coldly. "Mr. Sloan, your own correspondence shows approval of these manipulations. Your initials appear beside every fraudulent adjustment. Haven Capital doesn't engage with falsified assets. We're withdrawing our interest, pending an internal investigation." The room imploded into chaos. Executives whispered. Phones buzzed. PR heads panicked. And I quietly gathered the untouched coffee cups and turned toward the door. Before I left, I leaned slightly toward Sloan's chair and whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, "Next time you demote someone, make sure they didn't write the systems manual." His hand trembled. You did this?" I smiled. "No, Mr. Sloan. You did this. I just made sure everyone saw it." As I walked down that corridor, the same one where I'd once been humiliated, I didn't feel victory in the loud, dramatic sense. It was quieter, colder, fitting. By the next morning, the news had spread like wildfire. Haven Capital officially suspended negotiations. The board demanded an emergency review. And Mr. Sloan? He was temporarily relieved of duties pending investigation. In corporate terms, he was done. That night, I got a call from Edward. "You do realize," he said with a chuckle, "you just dismantled a multi-million-dollar acquisition with nothing but an audit report." I replied, "Not just an audit. The truth. And the truth never stays buried forever." For the first time in months, I slept soundly. Because while Sloan had tried to make me invisible, I had turned his arrogance into his undoing. He thought he could bury me under my own work. But that same work became his grave. And the acquisition he used to humiliate me, it became the very thing that exposed him. In the days following the boardroom fallout, the office felt surreal, like a city just after a storm. The usual chatter of promotions and deadlines had been replaced by whispers and careful glances. Everyone knew something had shifted, even if they didn't know the full story. Sloan was gone. Officially, he was suspended pending review, but everyone understood that his career at the firm had ended. Evelyn Ward, the once untouchable CFO, had vanished from meetings, her emails unanswered, her office cleared out overnight. The board had demanded her resignation, quietly, professionally, but definitively. No dramatic exit, no chance to spin a story. And me? I returned to my desk, the same one I'd been demoted to. But nothing felt the same. The same, Spreadsheets I once used for coffee runs were now my instruments of authority. I was reinstated, officially recognized for the work that had always been mine, and promoted to lead the acquisition cleanup. It wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about restoration. I spent the next weeks untangling the financial mess, renegotiating vendor contracts, and ensuring every audit line was validated. By the time the acquisition finalized successfully, legally compliant and fully transparent, the headlines shifted from scandal to corporate restructuring success. I never gloated. I didn't need to. The lesson was written across the firm in every shaken glance, every hushed acknowledgement. Arrogance has a way of eroding itself, and I had simply been the patient observer, letting the truth do the heavy lifting. The most satisfying part? Knowing that the very clause Evelyn had ignored, the one I had written quietly years before, had become the instrument of justice. It wasn't flashy. It didn't involve confrontation or threats. It worked quietly, surgically, perfectly. By the time I walked through the office, carrying a folder of clean reports to the board, I understood one thing. In corporate power games, control is fleeting. Influence is temporary, but careful preparation, knowledge, and patience are permanent. I had turned humiliation into strategy, obscurity into power, and most importantly, injustice into accountability. The office had changed. I had changed. And everything that once seemed like defeat had, in the end, been the perfect setup for victory. Revenge isn't always loud. It doesn't always come with dramatic confrontations or viral scandals. Sometimes it's quiet, calculated, patient. It's the kind of revenge that builds slowly, invisibly, until the moment arrives when the truth can no longer be ignored. They thought demoting me, making me invisible, would erase me. But invisibility has its power. When no one is watching, you see everything. You notice the cracks, the shortcuts, the arrogance that hides in plain sight. And when the time is right, patience and preparation become instruments of justice. I learned that in the world of corporate politics, the most effective victories are those that require no noise, only precision. Every document, every clause, every carefully archived email became my weapon. And in the end, it wasn't me who defeated them. It was the system itself, guided by the rules I had once written. Humiliation can either break you or refine you. I chose to refine myself. I chose strategy over emotion, patience over rage, calculation over impulsiveness, and it worked. This is revenge untold, where silent persistence beats arrogance, and truth always finds its way to the surface. This is karma unfolded, where every secret finds its reckoning. Don't forget to subscribe.